Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the Israelite podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Lawrence Schiffman. And today's discussion is based upon his book titled Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, the History of Judaism, the Background of Christianity, the Lost Library of Qumran. I have a link to purchase his book with the History Value Amazon affiliate link in the description below. With that being said, it's good to have you back on the podcast, Lawrence.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So I'd like to start off with the different ideas, the different theories about which group is behind or largely behind the scrolls. You talk about the Zealot hypothesis, and some pushed the Christian hypothesis, and then you have the Essene hypothesis. Can you tell us a bit about all that?
Yeah, let's start by eliminating some things that are sort of out of the question. Today, no responsible scholars are arguing that these are Christian texts. Carbon-14 dating disproves that without any question, let alone the content, which emphasizes tremendously things like Jewish law and has many very substantial differences from the teachings of early Christianity. So you can cross that one out. Already crossed out many years ago was the idea that it was the medieval sect of the Jews called the Karaites, who only accept the written law and don't accept the idea of an oral law that the rabbis saw as so important. And that idea has also been eliminated by carbon dating and by archaeological dating and all kinds of other stuff like that, paleography, which is the study of the history of the script. So those views are out. Another early view that's been disproven is that these are actually the Pharisees, the forerunners of the Talmudic rabbis. We can tell without too much trouble that the Jewish law views of this group are like those of the Sadducees, or the opponents of the Pharisees, those who had stressed rather, again, the more literal meaning of the text, and who also were connected with the priestly aristocracy. So basically, those views have sort of fallen off, except where we are now is that the Essene hypothesis, which I'll mention in a few minutes, is certainly the dominant hypothesis. I've raised some questions about it, and certainly I do take the view that the group was founded by some priests that came from the Tzadokite group of priests, who are the very same ones that underlie the sect of the Sadducees. But nonetheless, I have to admit that the Essene theory has a lot to recommend it. Let's just briefly explain that the Essenes are one of the three groups, along with the Pharisees and Sadducees, that Josephus mentions when he gets to the period of about 150 BCE. And that's right after the Maccabean revolt, which of course is the Hanukkah story as we know it. So at any rate, this group is mentioned by Josephus and described, and Pliny the Elder says that it inhabited an area north of Masada on the Dead Sea. And that, of course, matches the idea of the place of Qumran. So these and some parallels in terms of the way of life have convinced, I think, the majority of scholars that we really are talking here about a group of Essenes. Now, my problem is that, first of all, the Essenes are defined as two groups, or at least two types of Essenes, marrying and celibate. Now, there's been debate, therefore, about the sectarian materials from Qumran. Do they speak about marriage? I think it's pretty clear they do. Do they expect celibacy? Well, if they do, there's not a word about it. So maybe these are Josephus's marrying Essenes. So I've sort of coined a funny word, Essenoid. And I jokingly say that this group, like some other related groups, should best be called Essenoid. It's connected with the Essenes. We don't really know if the Essenes were one group. And let me tell you here another piece of bad news. We don't know what the word Essene means, and we don't have it in any ancient text in Hebrew, only in Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention the Essenes as a name. But having said that, the vast majority of Dead Sea Scroll scholars, to be honest, believe that the Essenes are the group that constituted the Dead Sea Scroll sect.
Can you expand on the connection with the Sadducees? And my second part to that question is, what about the Sadducees supposedly not believing in the resurrection? Don't the Dead Sea Scrolls believe in resurrection?
Yeah, okay. So hopefully I'll remember the two parts. So what happened is that in 1984, a text became known which made very clear that the Jewish law views of the sectarians at Qumran match those, and I think a lot of their biblical interpretation matches those, of the group which is known as the Sadducees, this priestly group that was the aristocracy to a great extent in Jerusalem and controlled the high priesthood. Now, they had Jewish law views that are closer to the literal text than those of the Pharisees, even though it's really not a literal interpretation. But anyhow, they're more closer to literal interpretation. So I came up with the view that actually what had happened is that after the Maccabean revolt, so this is a little complicated because we have to tell a story inside a story inside a story here. And the story inside the story is that the Hanukkah story, the way most people think it ended, is not the end. Judah the Maccabee comes in, rededicates the temple, lights the menorah, and the Jews live happily and ever after. That's not what happened. Judah and his followers were kicked out again by the Seleucids, the Syrian, let's call them descendants of Alexander the Great's empire. And they kicked out Judah the Maccabee and his men. And they were in the wilderness wandering until 152 BCE, because by that time, Antiochus IV, who was the one who led the persecution of the Hanukkah story, he was out of the scene. He had died. And there were two people were competing to be the king of Seleucid Syria. And both of them turned to Jonathan, the brother of Judah. Judah had been killed in battle since then. And Jonathan was commanding the forces, and turned to him and offered him to be the ruler of an independent Judea if he would support them. And he had 10,000 soldiers. So he supported a certain Demetrius, putting him on the throne, and that Demetrius put him as high priest and ruler of the people of Judea. And that's when the story really ended in 152 BCE with the start of what we call the Hasmonean Empire. The Hasmoneans ruled until 63 BCE when the Romans took over. Now, so the point here is that's the story inside the story. So go back to our story. You have a bunch of priests who believed in the way of the Sadducee system of Jewish law interpretation. However, they were not of the really Hellenized types, but they believed in that interpretation. And when the Hasmoneans took over in 152, they followed Pharisee-like rulings regarding sacrifices in the temple. And this was considered very negative by some pious Sadducee priests who went out and apparently formed our sect. That's my view about this. Now, that means that this is what they start out as, the core group of priests. There are scholars who think this is wrong, but this is the way I see it. Now, what then happens is that they develop into the Qumran sect as we see it. And the Qumran sect as we see it is what these other scholars are saying are the Essenes. Now, the second question that you asked is, well, wait a minute. The Dead Sea Scrolls seem to accept the idea of resurrection of the dead. And the Sadducees were known by Josephus as not to accept that idea. So we have to understand that whoever formed our group, whether they are the Essenes or they're not the Essenes, whoever they are, developed their own ideology, and the group developed an ideology. So there is no question that they differ from the Hellenized Sadducees described by Josephus, and whether that is because of inner differences of opinion among Sadducees or development within the Qumran sect, it's not, let's put it this way, reasonable to look at Josephus's discussion of the Sadducees and say, if this isn't the same as the scrolls, there can't be a Sadducean core. The Sadducean core seems to be recommended by the large amount of legal and interpretive material in the scrolls that seems to match the approach of the Sadducees.
Can you tell us about the dualism and the community rule?
Yeah, so the community rule is a work that was among the first 7 scrolls found by the Bedouin boy, or boys, because there really was a second guy with him. And that text describes at great length how you get into the sect and how the sect works, and they call it the community rule of the community. And this document has an ideological sort of core at the beginning. And it speaks about extreme dualism in which the world is divided as well, not only this world, but the heavenly world, into the forces of good and the forces of evil. And the forces of good and evil are locked in a kind of eternal battle. And eventually the forces of good are going to win. And this is a key point. It's predestined if you, I, anybody else, is in the forces of good and the forces of evil. And according to where we are predestined is where we are. So you have a dualism in terms of the idea that the world is divided between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and they're all fighting it out for who is going to control the universe. And in our case, the sons of light expect to be able to defeat the sons of darkness, return to Jerusalem, and rebuild and run the temple according to the way they want it to be.
Who is the teacher of righteousness?
Well, I can answer that in a wise guy manner and say we don't know. That is to say, we don't know his name. But the teacher of righteousness is an early leader of the sect. There is a text which says that he came into leadership 20 years after the beginning, the separation of the sectarians from the mainstream. I don't know whether we should take that number literally, but clearly there was a period he's not the founder, and he becomes the main teacher. And this term, teacher of righteousness, could just likely be termed or translated the correct teacher. Anyhow, this teacher of righteousness for one generation is a leader of the sect. He passes away. Now, an important point is that the teacher of righteousness is not Jesus. I mentioned before carbon 14 dating and other reasons. There's no question it's impossible. However, what is definitely true is that the teacher of righteousness gives us the image of what a sectarian Jewish teacher would be like in the period of the Second Temple. And we could get some ideas about what expectations would be of such a teacher and how the teacher would operate, et cetera, from the scrolls.
What does Pesher Habakkuk tell us about the righteous teacher? And my second part of that question is, who are his enemies?
Who, I'm sorry, what's the second half?
Who are his enemies?
Oh, his enemies. Okay, sure. So what we learn about him is that he was a priest, that is to say, from the descendants of Aaron, that he was understood to be able to give correct interpretations of biblical prophecies as part of this Pesher form of interpretation, which is a two-part interpretation. The idea there is that in Pesher, you have the original prophecy, and then the prophet doesn't really understand what his words are about because they're really about the Second Temple period. And then what happens is that in the Second Temple period, there comes the teacher of righteousness, and he is able to translate or explain what these prophecies are really about pertaining to the sectarian group themselves. And that's really what's going on there. Now, to understand this better, we have to explain that they have these commentaries for parts of Isaiah, for elements of the minor prophets, and in these commentaries they explain the Bible as if it's referring not to ancient times, 7th century BCE, right, 6th century BCE. No, it's applying to their time, and therefore it's about them and what's going to happen. So then we can understand. They give us a sort of sense of their own history here. And one of the things that's clear, and now this gets to the second part of the question, is that they are beset by terrible enemies who disagree with the sect's ideology and its religious practice, etc. Now, it's clear that these enemies, one group of enemies, is certainly the Pharisees, because they're mentioned. They're called by a code name, Ephraim. However, it's clear that there are other enemies that they have, and one of the main enemies is called the wicked priest, who's obviously the Hasmonean priest. Now, I would say it's Jonathan, from what I would guess about when the teacher was functioning. However, some think that the teacher was a little later. If you think the teacher was a little later, then you might be talking about Simon, Jonathan's brother, who ruled after him. But that seems to be generally what we're talking about in terms of who the wicked priest is. Now, the wicked priest is a leader of a group of people who can't stand the teacher and what he and his sectarian group represent.
Can you tell us more about why you identify the wicked priest with Jonathan?
Why? With the first half of what you said, I didn't get.
Can you tell us a bit about why you think Jonathan is the wicked
Oh,
priest?
well, look, if the teacher of righteousness was come to leadership shortly after the sect was founded, and I think the sect was founded in about 150 BCE, then I need the priest, the high priest with whom they're disagreeing, and this MMT document shows clearly that they disagree with the priesthood and with the high priest. He's got to be alive at the same time. So the guy who's alive at the same time is Jonathan. If you think it happened a little later, then it's Simon. You see my point? What we got to do is, if we know where the teacher of righteousness is, we know his enemy. But we don't 100% know when he is, so we don't 100% know who his enemy is.
Who are the house of Absalom referenced in Pesher Habakkuk?
Yeah, I think we don't know who these people are. They oppose the sect and the teacher, and the theories cover everybody under the sun. Pharisees is a pretty good view. Others think that it's former sectarians. There are some other enemies. There's the liar, who appears to be a leader of the Pharisees. It seems like you have to realize that the sect was not popular. They're very popular for us because they provided us fantastic material for a time period in which we had very little information. But they were very unpopular in ancient times. And it seems there was nobody that could stand them, if you want to put it that way.
What do we know about the distribution of the manuscripts?
Well, the distribution of manuscripts, which you're hinting at, is a question of which manuscripts are in which cave. So what is very clear, let's erase for a moment Cave 7 that had only Greek texts and just had a few manuscripts. What's very clear is that the distribution of manuscripts, contrary to some things that you hear, is approximately the same in all of the caves. But the problem with this whole discussion is that it does not take into sufficient account the fact that there are caves near the sectarian center that must have been where they kept their volumes, their library, whereas their scrolls. Whereas there are other caves in which apparently materials were thrown at the end when the Romans were coming to attack the place and they wanted to save these manuscripts. But at any rate, if you take the profile of Cave 1, Cave 4, these profiles, when it comes to what they contain, are fairly close. Now, there's another view who doesn't agree with what I just said. That other view says that there were different sects, and these different sects all came to Qumran and deposited their material here, and that we have the material of a number of sects. I don't think that that's really true. I think that the representative samples show that they are all approximately the same type of collection, and I would say that it's a uniform collection from that point of view. But there are some people who don't agree.
And can you tell us about the Zadokite fragments, and do they contain any Sadducean links?
Okay, so what happens with the so-called Damascus document or Sadducite fragments, that's the same text, is that it was first known from the Cairo-Geniza in medieval manuscripts, an 8th and 9th century and maybe 10th, 11th century, two incomplete manuscripts. It gave us what we now know to be about 1/4 of the text. Now, when the scrolls first were discovered, Elazar Lipas Ukenik, who was then the head of the Institute for Archaeology that he had founded at the Hebrew University, he immediately realized that the new scrolls connected up with this Damascus document or Sadducite fragments, whichever name you prefer. Now, not only that, but it was very clear to him that this is describing the same sect which lived in the Second Temple times, and eventually 10 manuscripts of this text, partial manuscripts, were discovered at Qumran. So now we have, we think, maybe 3/4 of the document, but we're not sure. There's a lot more new material. Now, the material overall consists of an admonition at the beginning, and this admonition is a kind of a speech, and the speech quotes at great length from Ezekiel about the role of the Sadducite priests, and it numerous times mentions the priests, the sons of Zadok. Those are the main priestly group from Jerusalem that ran the high priesthood that are often referred to as Sadducees. And that group is specifically mentioned in the Damascus document. And they're mentioned several times, and their specific views are given in the second section, which is the Jewish law section. Now, when you get to the Jewish law section, you see that what you're dealing with is laws that are similar to the ones that we know from the Temple Scroll and from the MMT document. And here's just one example of a text that apparently fits into this type of legal reasoning. We have a text there which says that a person, since the Torah says that you may not marry let me get it right. The Torah says you may not marry your aunt, and hence, therefore, you cannot marry your niece. Now, this idea is opposite to rabbinic law and Pharisaic law that allows a person to marry his niece. In the United States, all the states forbid this because of Christian views. Because what happens is that the very same view that the Sadducees held, which said that a person could not marry his niece, turns out to have been the view taken up by early Christianity as well, and therefore it's considered forbidden. But it was the opposite to the Pharisaic view which permitted it. I just quote that as an example. You could quote a lot of examples.
What exactly is the Paleo Exodus narrative?
It's not, the narrative is not paleo, the manuscript is paleo. Paleo, which means ancient, simply means that the script in which the text is written is the old Hebrew script from before the Persian period, and it's the old one that matches the Canaanite Phoenician script. And when they say 4Q Paleo Exodus M, that's actually a wonderful manuscript, very complete manuscript. 4Q means K4 in Qumran. Paleo means the old Hebrew script. It means Exodus, and the number of manuscripts in the list of Exodus manuscripts from K4, it already reached M, starting with A, obviously, right? And would go on from there, and this is one of those manuscripts. That's what the abbreviation means. So there is no paleo narrative.
Yeah, that's what I meant. What does the Dead Sea Scrolls say about women?
Well, about the Dead Sea Scrolls say about women. So I have to say this is funny. When I wrote the book Reclaiming Dead Sea Scrolls, so I put a whole chapter about women. The truth is, though, there's not that much information. Let's go first, not to the scrolls, but to the cemetery at Qumran. Now, the main cemetery at Qumran contains about 1,200 graves, and some of them were excavated during the Jordanian period. It's illegal to excavate cemeteries in Israel, but they excavated the Jordanian period, and the main cemetery had no women or children. But women or children, about 120 of them, are in a side cemetery. So this raised the possibility of whether the group is celibate. The problem is that we have absolute textual evidence that says that you should get married and have sexual relations. So that doesn't sound like celibacy. Furthermore, we have numerous laws pertaining to the ritual purity and impurity of women, as well as we have laws that have to do with even some matters of marriage. So my personal view is that they weren't celibate, and that the reason why there's so many men and so few women there is because men came there to proceed through the later stages of the initiation process, and they came there for a period of time, and then they would go home where there were other members of the group, and therefore they left their families, and the only people who had family there were the people who ran it, and their wives and children, if they passed away, unfortunately, were buried there. Now, so that is one of the big issues, whether one can understand the cemetery to mean that there were no women in the sect. And that is a view of many scholars. It certainly was the original view of the group of Christian scholars that worked with it, because they were used to the idea of monasticism, and they considered Qumran to be a monastery, etc. Now, if you wipe away that archaeological question for a moment and start reading the text depends which ones. So the rule of the community doesn't mention women. So there are people say, proves it's celibate. So I always joke and say, what big important American document does not mention women? The Constitution. And the people who wrote the Constitution were not celibate. So I'm not sure that's any evidence. The scrolls mention women in quite a number of halachic, that is to say, Jewish law contexts. There also are a few specific texts that are very interesting. There is a text that regards a so-called wicked woman, which basically means an immoral woman, who's beckoning some guy to come in and have relations with her, in which the scrolls are very critical in that document of this woman. And this is in the spirit of the material in Proverbs. And then we have a description of the beauty of Sarai, the wife of Abraham, before her name was changed to Sarah. And that is a beautiful document talking about her beauty and her wisdom and everything else like that. And then we have a variety of texts. For example, we have these legal texts, just as an example, right? If a woman it's forbidden to marry, according to sectarians, a woman who has had relations after death of her husband with someone who's not her husband. Or another interesting case that we have is that we have a strange idea about divorce, that it's possible to get divorced, but as long as one of the spouses is alive, one may not get remarried. Well, these are laws that don't seem to be talking about celibacy, seem to be talking about women. But on the other hand, the women seem to be secondary members through their husband. And so for that reason, we don't have very much about women in the scrolls. Now, I should say, if we go to the wisdom text, which is not the rule of the community, you're going to see a lot of stuff about women. Some women might not like what it says, how the women have to obey their husband and stuff like this. It's a little old-fashioned for us. But the reality is you have there a lot of material about women.
What is the Ben Sira text?
Well, Ben Sira is a text which is also known as the Wisdom of Ben Sira. It's a wisdom text which was composed in about 180 BCE. It was translated in 132 or so BCE and found its way into the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, as part of those books that are regarded as the Apocrypha. Now, at some point, it started to become clear that the Cairo Geniza had parts of it in Hebrew. So there was a big argument about whether those are really original Hebrew or Hebrew retro translated from the Greek. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a few samples of Ben Sira were found here or there. One poem from Ben Sira found its way into the Qumran Psalm scroll. And so more Hebrew knowledge was starting to come. And then when Yigael Yadin excavated Masada, they found a scroll containing basically the last 2/3 of the book. And even though it's very fragmentary, this restored everyone's faith in the medieval texts, saying that these medieval texts really do derive from the original Hebrew. And so it's clear now that we have large parts of this book in the original composition language.
What does a Psalm scroll say about God's nature?
Well, first of all, we have to realize most of the Psalm scroll is biblical Psalms. So it's the God of Israel. It's the God who created the universe, who gave the Torah, who requires human beings to behave well, who protects human beings, but maybe isn't protecting them enough because the psalmist may be whoever has composed a given psalm, is praying to God to protect him from difficulties, is calling on God to help him. And you've got quite a bit of that. You've got some psalms that appear to be connected with worship, psalms that speak about the enthronement of God. These are all the regular biblical psalms materials. Then you have some other material that has been added. And these are prayers which sort of would fit what we would expect in the Second Temple composition. Either they accent some of the very same things, God is a creator, etc., all the same stuff. Or they may have a little bit of a different take. And the little bit of a different take is maybe a little bit more updated, but it's basically the same common beliefs. Now, the very interesting thing in the Psalm scroll is that there's a kind of coda to the end. Scholars call it colophon, excuse me. And what it does is colophon, I pronounced the word wrong 3 times in a row, colophon, Phon. And this is a conclusion which claims that David composed all the Psalms and he composed numerous other Psalms, numerous, 4,500 for this, numbers like that, which were supposedly composed. And our scroll is said to compose a section of these. But at any rate, that's basically a kind of a quick idea.
Can you tell us about pseudo-jubilees and what it says about Abraham and Isaac and also the angel Mastema?
Yeah, it's a beautiful story there. Well, first of all, the pseudo-jubilees, let me explain. You have to know what jubilees is to start with. Jubilees is a book. The entire book was preserved in Ethiopic and parts of it in Greek. Ethiopic, by that I mean Gez, which is Semitic Ethiopic, not Amharic that they speak today. Now, this work was preserved, and starting in like the 1700s, all these like what we call pseudepigraphal works from Eastern churches were being brought into Europe, and the book of Jubilees became known. Now, the book of Jubilees is a retelling of the story of Genesis through the beginning of Exodus, which is based on calculation of dates based on Jubilee years, but much of it is to claim that the patriarchs, you might say, pre-practiced post-Sinai Judaism. So within that context, right, that work, small pieces of it were preserved in Greek, and small pieces, a number of manuscripts were found at Qumran of what would have been the original Hebrew. Unfortunately, it's just small fragments, and we don't really have it, but we have the little pieces. Now, it seems that just as people had a way of writing takeoffs on biblical works that we call pseudo, like somebody could write a pseudo Job, where he takes off on the story of Job and writes who knows what. So these type of works could also be written on a work like Jubilees. So pseudo Jubilees is a work that's like Jubilees. It tries to expand on Jubilees. And it tells the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, where, first of all, the whole temptation is run by the evil angel Mastema. The evil angel Mastema, that's Hebrew Mastema, which basically means destruction, is a parallel to Belial, Hebrew Belial, who in the sectarian texts appears all over as the cause of all kinds of evil. So Mastema is the one who sets up this test for Abraham. And then the main point of the story is that when the attempts to explain the blindness of Isaac by the fact that the angels in heaven were crying when Abraham was asked to pick up his hand and slaughter his son, before there was the angel that stopped him, according to the way the story is told there. But at any rate, what happens, whereas God tells him in the book of Genesis to stop, but it's an angel in the book of Jubilees, because Jubilees is very intent on keeping God away from physical action. So at any rate, the angels are crying, and the tears fall into the eyes of Isaac. And that's why it says later on that he was blind. This is also a whole notion which is found in the rabbinic midrash. So what it shows us is that some of the material in these books that we call pseudepigraphic survived into the later rabbinic texts. But anyhow, that's the basic story about Isaac and the Akedah, the process of the sacrifice that didn't happen, you could say.
Can you tell us about these other apocryphal texts like the Genesis Apocryphon that are expanding?
Genesis Apocryphon is a really interesting text. It's written in Aramaic. We say that all the Aramaic texts are earlier than the sectarian texts. This is because we assume that Aramaic, which was the language of the Persian Empire, continued into the early Hellenistic period, and that Hebrew was revived by the Maccabees in the later Hellenistic period. So by the time the Qumran sect came into being, there was a lot of Hebrew being used. Now, so this Aramaic text is an attempt to sort of expand on the stories of Genesis. It's not all preserved, but there are parts of it that are pretty well preserved. So one of my favorite examples that they give there is like, why did Abraham lie about his wife and say she's his sister? So a very simple answer: God came to him in a dream and told him to do it. That's a sample of what's in this kind of text. So it's a fascinating exposition of the book of Exodus. in which, as you go along, you see that the author has read in a variety of interpretations, and these interpretations represent early biblical interpretation. But it's a really interesting genre because it's what we call rewritten Bible. The author rewrote the Bible while translating and expanded it into a sort of alternate story. Now, another funny thing, it's not funny, I guess, about this text is that this text deteriorated in the storage in Jordan before 67, and parts of it cannot be read because of that deterioration. It's a very unfortunate thing.
And what about these other Testament texts that we have that are expanding these narratives? What is the point of doing that?
Okay, so it's very important to understand that rewriting is a form of interpretation. And the Bible, in so many places, just calls out and says, interpret me. Tell me what this means, what that means. So now one of the modes of interpretation is to rewrite. So some of these texts take the biblical sections, they rewrite them and expand them, putting in their interpretations. But there's much more to a number of these testaments. A number of these testaments are pegged to biblical figures before the Sinai covenant. And they try to make the explicit point, and especially when it talks about Levi, who's, of course, the ancestor of the priesthood and the Levites, who are sort of assistants to the priests. Now, what happens here is that you've got not simply the presentation of a kind of rewrite of the biblical statements about what these tribes would go on to be later on, but this rewrite adds this fascinating interpretations. And one of the main points of these interpretations is to argue that there is a pre-Sinai covenant with these earlier figures, and that pre-Sinai covenant is even more important than the Sinai covenant, and it exaggerates the importance of these figures historically, while seeing them as important to this function of getting a haircut. It sounds funny to say that, right? But these type of stuff that you have going on there, right? And you find in these texts that all kinds of strange, types of things, but that the priests are required to get certain haircuts and other things like that. These things are part of a covenant that was reached way before there was even a covenant at Sinai, according to these documents.
What is the temple scroll?
This is my favorite text. So the temple scroll is a rewrite of the Bible from the end of Exodus, where it commands the building of the tabernacle, to the middle of Deuteronomy. But here it's changed into a command to build a gigantic temple, and all of the laws of sacrifice of how to conduct that temple, which you need to know, are put into this text. And it represents thinking that clearly is according to the line of the priestly system of Jewish law, which shows the evidence of this Sadducite/Sadducee group. Now, I, along with a colleague who was once upon a time a student, Professor Andrew Gross of Catholic University of America, we published a brand new edition of this text, bringing all its manuscripts together. I had previously published a book of essays on this text, scholarly articles explaining parts of it, and together with some others had published a preliminary new edition, and here we created a new edition bringing together all the manuscripts, and also with a commentary and a concordance and index of words, which is very extensive. And this text, by the way, you need to know, maybe is the longest Dead Sea Scroll, and it's quite an important text.
And what type of theology does it teach?
Well, the main theology of this book is a type of biblical theology, but it emphasizes tremendously the idea that the divine presence rests in the temple. This is over and over. And even though we believe that this document was made up, the temple scroll, from a number of pre-existing documents, nonetheless, every one of them has this idea of the dwelling of God, the indwelling of God in the temple. So what it's really pushing is that the temple has to be the center of Judaism. And this is being pushed at a time when, for whatever reason, even before its destruction, there seems to be some resistance to that. But these guys are pushing the temple as the center. And of course, what they want is a gigantic rebuilt temple that will function according to their views of Jewish law, not those of those who are currently running the temple.
Can you tell us a bit more about what you see as links between the Qumran sect and the Sadducees, like even with like words and terminology?
Well, if the real links have to do with views of Jewish law. Now, I just give one small example. So, and you're going to see from this how these things are all minutiae. No question, they are minutiae. But then I'll give you a non-minutiae at the end. So we'll start with the one example of minutiae. So I have a vessel which contains in it pure water. This water, therefore, may be drunk by a person who wishes to enter the temple, as opposed to some other water. Now I have this water, and I have a vessel which is impure. If I pour from the pure vessel with the pure water, and there is a continuous stream going into the impure vessel, does the impurity go backwards and render the original source impure or not? Now, the Pharisees say no to that. The Sadducees say yes, it's impure. The top vessel becomes impure and the water in it becomes impure. That's the view here of the sectarians, matching the Sadducee view as opposed to the Pharisee view. Now, that happens a lot of times. And if you see enough of them, you start to realize that this is a pattern. Now, let me give you the wider context issue. The people who created these documents and gathered them, it's clear that they see the temple as the central organization of Judaism. Now, why do I say that? Because, just take example, they have a Messiah of Ehrman, who's the main Messiah in one of their messianic views. According to this messianic view, there are two Messiahs. The important one is of Ehrman, and then a lesser one of Israel, who handles temporal affairs. So you see that they see the temple as the central institution of the society, the organizing principle of Israelite society, rather than an aspect of a wider society. Now, that is a very big thing. Hence, when we look at the ideology of the temple as the place God dwells, never mind that the Pharisees agree with that. But for the sectarians, that becomes exceedingly important in the temple scroll. So that's a kind of a sense, I think, of the minor and larger scale ways in which they adopt views that fit a Sadducean view about centrality of the temple. And I think that's what you got here.
What is the Book of the Mysteries?
The Book of the Mysteries. The Book of Mysteries is a work that just keeps talking over and over about the need to understand the mysteries of the way the world works. These mysteries appear to be two kinds of mysteries: the way in which the natural world is set up and operates, and also the way in which history unfolds and will eventually lead to the successful coming of the Messiah. And all of this together seems to be the mysteries that we are supposed to look at, investigate. No, but they don't tell us what they are. They keep telling us to know them, to understand them, but no idea what they are.
And when was it written?
Well, it would have been written somewhere based on the manuscripts, probably 100 BCE, something like that. But this is, of course, a guess because, we can talk about when works seem to fit, but it's not the same thing as having a piece that you can carve in 14 day. But the problem is that even if you do carve in 14 day, you don't know that that work did not exist hundreds and hundreds of years before. So that's the problem. We often don't have a way to know. It looks like it comes from the Hellenistic period.
What do these texts say about the angelic hosts?
Well, they have quite a bit because the angelic hosts are fighting, according to the war of the sons of light against sons of darkness. They're fighting in heaven in parallel to the battle that's supposed to happen in the end of days. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is no detail about this, but one assumes that they would be militarily organized. They also talk about the archangels. For example, Michael, who is an archangel in Daniel, becomes the central force of good leader of the heavenly angels in the war scroll. Now, there are also some passages which keep saying, we have 3 or 4 of them, that the angels are among the community. So apparently, angels are what is the representation of the divine within the community. And that is said a couple of times. So that's a kind of a quick overview.
Can you tell us who exactly are the sons of light and sons of darkness?
Well, the sons of light are the sectarians. The sons of darkness is everybody else. Plain and simple. They thought they were the only ones who were right. Everybody else was wrong.
What did the community at Qumran envision to be the end of days? What did they think it would look like?
They thought that what would happen is there would be a big war in which they and anyone who joined them would be victorious over all the nations and over any Jews who opposed them. They would then go to the temple. They would then build a gigantic temple, such as the one mentioned in the temple scroll. They would then perform the worship there and have a society in which that temple was the main entity ruling over that society. And I think that they assumed that it would take up the whole, basically, of Judea, Samaria, etc., occupying the main part of what is the land of Israel. And they expanded that. They expected that to happen in their own days.
And what was their role exactly? What were they supposed to do when this apocalypse came?
Else and be the only ones left, because they thought everybody else was no good. And it's quite an extensive list of who's no good, because there's nobody in there who's going to be considered good except people who joined their group.
And who is this Messiah that's supposed to come? And was there supposed to be some kind of messianic war?
Well, there are 2 messianic views in the scrolls. One, the Davidic Messiah, the same as we know from Judaism, that gets reflected in Christianity. 2, the idea of 2 messiahs. One Messiah would be a priestly Messiah, would be the real big shot, and then there will be an Israel Messiah who handles temporal affairs. Now, this latter view is often overemphasized as if it's the only view in the scrolls, but both of those views are present. Now, the Messiah is indeed supposed to be a leader, but what's not clear according to the text is, does he come before or after the Messianic war? But the idea that there has to be a great war before the coming of the Messiah, which is of course reflected in such things as Ezekiel's view of Gog, the king. We saw Gog and Magog, but it's really Gog, the king of Magog, defeating the forces of evil. And that's exactly the same kind of point of view you have here. The sectarians are assumed to constitute an army and defeat all of the foes of the forces of evil. If you ask how are they going to do it, who knows, right? No weapons were found at Qumran. I think they found one knife somewhere in the archaeological evidence. So, what's doing? Were they really intending that this war would take place? They would participate. Who knows? We don't know.
And can you tell us about the War Scroll?
Well, the War Scroll is a fantastic text. First of all, I'll just tell you something funny about it. So the War Scroll talks as if everybody's going to be killed except for the sectarians. But then it talks about in the end of days, all the nations are going to come up to worship at the mountain of the Lord, which of course is Isaiah. Well, I thought we just killed them. So apparently you can't take everything literally in this text. The text is made up of some documents, and they don't necessarily agree with one another, but it starts out by talking about a series of battles which are kind of schematized in time and place between the sectarians, in which they defeat all of those nations that surround them that were considered to be their enemies. When that's finished, they apparently defeat Israelites who don't join them. But one imagines that if they were victorious among all those nations, it's not to get a lot of Israelite converts. But anyhow, after that happens, right, the end of days comes. And the end of days is the sectarian community. They assume they would be run by these messiahs. And then, right, they rebuild the temple and rebuild the city in accord with their expectations. So all of that is in the War Scroll. along with beautiful poetry in praise of God to be recited at various points of the battle, and an awful lot of information about Greco-Roman military procedure, how you use trumpets to direct the troops, how the troops are organized, who's in what unit, who's not in what unit, what age in what unit. There's all this kind of fantastic information about the conduct of the battle itself.
And what do we know about the communal meal?
Well, we know that you had to be ritually pure. We know that the group assembled, apparently, we assume every day, based on Josephus' description of the Essenes, but we don't know that, to have these communal meals in which there would be a certain preference given to a priestly leader to eat of the first portion, and then they would eat the meal. Everybody there would be in ritual purity. You couldn't come. If you weren't pure, you wouldn't come. And everyone received their fair share of food. And that's basically what we know, right? We do have a pantry next to a dining room in the Qumran excavations, which seems to indicate that this was real.
Can you tell us about the so-called pierced Messiah text
Yeah,
and
the
other
so-called pierced
controversial
Messiah
texts?
text, you could say in a certain sense, doesn't exist. It really was a text completely misunderstood. There's a text that describes the manner in which, when the war is being conducted, the leader of the sect will eventually attack the leader of the Kittim, and the Kittim or Kittim are the Romans. And when he catches this guy, he's going to kill the Roman leader. This was misunderstood as if it meant that the Roman leader is going to kill him, the messianic figure. And this misunderstanding caused a lot of people to think there really is a pierced Messiah text. It's really not. It is a text that gives us interesting extra information about the way the war scroll worked and what was associated with the war scroll in terms of additional texts and additional battles. But there is no pierced Messiah. No Messiah gets pierced.
Was the righteous teacher supposed to rise from the dead after 40 years and be involved in any way and at the end of days?
Well, I'm not sure I got the question. Maybe you better ask it again.
Sure. Was the righteous teacher supposed to rise from the dead in 40 years and be involved in any way
I
at the
don't know
apocalypse?
I don't know any evidence for that. It just says that he died. Now, the question about coming back, the dead coming back, right? So that type of resurrection, where an individual would be resurrected to become a leader in the end of days, I don't believe is mentioned. I'm sure you can find somebody who said, again, this is all the people who try to Christianize the scrolls, try to find things in it that they know from Christianity, but I don't think it's a real thing.
Can you tell us about the Bar Kokhba documents?
Yeah, so, there was a great revolt of the Jews against Rome. Let's get a little bit of history here. Remember, in 63 BCE, the Hasmonean Empire came to an end. The Romans conquered the land of Israel. So they ruled it, and in the middle you have Herod ruling as a client king. But there began to be a revolt, and officially the revolt begins in 66 CE. That's substantially after the composition of the Qumran documents. 66 CE, and it runs, the first revolt, to the year 73 when Masada was destroyed. Now then, there was a period of calm, and another revolt ensued between 132 to 5 of the Jews of the land of Israel. That revolt was under a messianic type pretender named, his real name, Bar Kosiba, as we know from the text. Now, he and his administration left us, because people fled to caves, left us some really interesting texts. First of all, there's Hebrew Bible text. By this time, the Hebrew Bible that they're using is almost the same as ours. Then there are two other types of materials. Letters, military letters between Bar Kokhba and his administrators, especially at Ein Gedi and around the shore of the Dead Sea. and legal documents that people brought with them to the caves where they hid and where they were eventually killed by the Romans, so that they would have their legal documents pertaining to their lives when the war ended. And the latter two things we call the Bar Kokhba documents, the legal documents that they had and the documents pertaining, and of course, to life, so to speak, at the time. Now, these documents have tremendous information for the history of Jewish law. They also have a linguistic kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, combination. Namely, you've got Nabatean Aramaic, which is a specific dialect closer to Arabic, regular Jewish Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, all appearing in text together. And these texts have given us a tremendous amount of information about the social and legal history of the land of Israel in the latter years before the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 5. And they've given us tremendous information, and they are what I always call the other Dead Sea Scrolls, because they get very little attention.
What did the Qumran sectarians do to remain pure so that they may be spared at the end of days?
Well, you didn't have to be pure for the end of days. That's you had to be pure for the present, in their view, to eat the communal meals and participate in the assemblies, etc. So they used ritual baths and followed all the laws of purification as if they were priests in the temple. And so they seemed to have bathed regularly. And this is something Josephus says about the Essenes as well. And as a result, they were able to remain pure within their community, which was the main purpose that they were after.
Was there a method at all for anyone else outside the group to get saved so they don't get perished at the end?
You have to join. You don't get saved if you don't join. That's basically what it amounts to. You need to join. If you join, you're going to be saved in the end of days from the battle, but you're going to be spiritually saved. And so that's basically the reality. You got to join.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Lawrence Schiffman.
Okay.
And I want to remind everybody to go get his book, The Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls. The link to purchase it is in the History by Amazon affiliate link in the description below. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.